Hey folks, Steve here with a very special video for you today. I'm going to be doing gaming on the road, and we'll be playing the Tannenberg introductory game for the Der Weltkrieg series. Now I do own Der Weltkrieg, all the boxed games in the series. I also had happened to have gotten this introductory game a long time ago, before I had managed to get a good deal on several copies of the box games, and it's kind of sat around unplayed for a long time. And I actually find myself away from home. So by the time you're watching this video, I'll be back home as usual. Um, this video is being recorded while I am away on a trip for work, and so while I am busy for the work activities, I do have a little bit of gaming time. So in my hotel room, I have this Tannenberg game set up, as you can see. So the map is a cutout, a smaller rendition of what comes in the East Front game, and is even slight. This scenario is probably a little bit adjusted from the Tannenberg scenario that you would find in that rule book. So I assume there's a couple of small differences, but I've got it set up here, and it's kind of a neat exercise to try to make something of the scenario while I'm here, and over the course of a few days at night before I go to bed and wake up and do more work stuff. I have an opportunity to do some gaming. And what's nice is this is a nice Ziploc folio game that doesn't take up a lot of space in luggage, so I could stick that in there and easy peasy get something on the table. Now, this scenario runs what is it? 9 turns, if I'm reading that right. So you start here, and what it is, while we don't have all the player aids of a full Der Weltkrieg game, we do have, there are 7 turns in a month, and so the game will refer to it as the first turn, third turn, fourth turn, fifth, sixth, seventh in a month, and then the month changes over with basically each turn being a couple of days, right? A few days, 3 days. So we start on the August turn 3. No rail movement is allowed. We transition August 4th. The end of turn 5, there's a special situation where, depending on how well the Russians are doing, the Germans get a bunch of reinforcements, but that actually hurts their margin of victory, essentially. So the Germans want to do as well as they can early, so they don't get a ton of reinforcements. That's going to hurt their victory capabilities. And then we get into some other turns of August where both sides start to get reinforcements, and then we get into September, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, and then we'll determine victory. Victory is going to be determined by comparing demoralization points. So up here on the game records track, there's going to be these DM markers, which are the demoralization levels, or demoralization points, maybe, for both sides. So we're going to use that turn, or not turn, the record track up there to capture the supply points for the headquarters and then the demoralization points. So the way that this is going to work is, depending on how close the Russians get to Königsberg, that's going to affect German demoralization. As you lose units, you'll gain demoralization. And basically, you don't want to have demoralization points. At the end of turn 9, we'll compare both sides' demoralization points and determine victory and the margin of victory based on the DM calculation. So they're basically, if you're killing off enemy units, you're going to give them demoralization. Makes sense. And then a few other cases. The rule book for this, if I just want to double check some of these things. The basic ones are, you get a point for each infantry or fortress strength point lost. In a combat, you get 2 demoralization points if that infantry strength point was lost via surrender or while surrounded. And then cavalry actually cost roughly double in terms of points, which is kind of interesting. you also get a bunch of DM points if your army headquarters are lost and destroyed, and you also get a bunch of demoralization points for each city that the enemy occupies. And um, both sides kind of have cities around, though really it's Germany who's got more in the near areas that would affect um, demoralization points for that. Now you do see there's a number of fortresses on the map, so there's some there around the Masurian Lakes. There's also some over right there. You can see a bunch of German ones. They're all the German fortresses are pretty strong. The Russian ones, by comparison, are pretty weak. There's a couple that are decent. Don't get me wrong, but there's also some other rules where Russian forts are just not as good as German fortresses, and if some of these weaker forts take any strength point losses, I believe they are removed. So I assume something to that effect exists in the big box game for the East Front in this specific scenario. They call some of that stuff out. Um, Now, I don't want this to be a whole deep, in-depth look at all the systems of Der Weltkrieg because I'm not sure I'm well positioned to explain all of it. Cavalry can do things like retreat before combat if attacked by infantry, so they can screen, which is valuable. The way that supply points work, your HQ basically is going to provide attacking units supply, and you spend the supply points from up here, assuming those units are within a decent line of communication from the HQ, and you need to spend that to attack. There are different things you can do to maybe spend less supply as the defender, and generally defenders get to triple their strength on defense when they counterattack, unless they choose to retreat, which lowers their loss but also lowers their counterattack capability. So there's these little tactical decisions, I guess you could say, you're making along the way. And obviously, if you're not familiar with Der Weltkrieg's map, the map is very interesting because each hex is actually divided into 6 hex sides, which allows for a greater level of granularity. So if you're like attacking from here to here, you're looking at forest, but if you're attacking from here to here, then you're looking at clear terrain. So it is definitely interesting. I do like it. Like, some people get weirded out by this, but I kind of like it quite a bit, and I'm good with it, at least for now. Um, so yeah, I don't want to get too far deep into all the rules of the game. They're really not that complicated. It's a lot of movement. Movement works about how you think it should work. Different terrain have different movement costs. You spend the movement, and then obviously the terrain also matters for combat. So like, the forest is going to make the attacker weaker and the defender stronger, usually. I'm pretty sure that's the way it works. Other terrain effects have their own modifications of things. And you can use things like rail movement and rail cap to move things around quickly. The Germans are probably going to want to do that as much as they reasonably can to be able to get the maneuver needed for the 8th Army to destroy the first Russian army, or rather the second Russian army, and then fight the first Russian army, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the historical scenario. The combat results table's over here. It is strength based with modifiers based on terrain and a couple of other factors around supply. So I have to kind of turn the camera over here for you to really look at that. There is technically a like 2023 CRT like change up that if you go find it on Consim World, it just changes the way things are calculated, and it does a better job, I guess, for like the Ottoman front or something in terms of handling small strength numbers fighting each other. But given I don't have that stuff with me and I don't want to go get it, I think the as published combat results table will do me just fine for this. So yeah, we're going to give it a go. And I should point out, Germany receives double the normal demoralization points for cities in Germany occupied by the enemy. So we definitely don't want to lose cities where we can help it because it's going to hurt. The German HQ is right here, which is kind of closer to the border. Maybe we want to worry about that. That could definitely be a source for demoralization points. So, um, yeah, this will be fun. At least worth a try. Now, there is a set of optional rules that I am going to play with because I think otherwise you're not going to get the historical situation, which is the Russian steamroller rules, where all the Russian units basically need to be advancing towards Königsberg from the start and for basically the first 3 turns of the game. And they just kind of have to do that. They have to be pushing forward. They had kind of an impetus to do that historically. If you didn't play with that optional rule, this would almost always be some kind of Russian victory because the Russian player is not going to make the same mistakes as to move their forces forward, and Germany is able to basically concentrate on one army at a time and defeat them. You probably wouldn't get that, so this optional rule is there to kind of keep things on a historical track. So I guess historically what would be happening here is the Russian Second Army moves north up this way. The Russian First Army is heading west, where they're kind of screened by some of these other units at the river lines and at different places, while basically the Germans pounce on that Second Army over here and manages to defeat them enough that they can kind of switch gears and very very quickly move then to engage the First Army, with the Masurian Lakes kind of being these rivers kind of being the dividing line that keeps the two armies separated. And again, the internal lines, the rail lines, which are these, they would look like roads in any other system. The dotted ones are single track rail lines. The thick line going through here, that's actually a double track rail line. And you gotta, this game's got some weird rules about how you use the rail hexes, so you have to actually be really cognizant of what rail paths you're using. But the Germans are going to want to use the rail movements and column movement to defeat the Russians coming up from the south, and then quickly shift the angle against the other army heading from the east, and that's how that should go. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm just going to play through. I'll show the aftermath of some of the early movement bits and phases. Technically, Germany's going to go first, which means that they can kind of set up how they would want to, knowing that these guys have all got to kind of move that way. So that's what we'll do, and I'll show the aftermath and talk through some of the stuff that we see. One thing, just to be specific, that Russian steamroller optional role affects the infantry, not the cavalry. So technically, the Russian cavalry don't have to be rushing forward. They can continue to screen and provide some additional value there, but there's only so much that those can do. It's not like these guys could go out raiding over here. These are unassailable fortresses, these gray hexed ones, gray border hexes. They can't be attacked, basically. And then even if these guys tried, there's just not enough strength points to try to knock these fortresses out. So there's only so much those cavalry can do. These ones can maybe be a bit more dangerous potentially, so we're gonna have to be careful of that. So that first German move is probably going to have to do with some of these units kind of pulling up and getting into a nice flank position, where they're going to get surrounded and eliminated, where these guys have to play space for time, basically. And what I may want to do is having some units either moved up or screening, and then whenever possible choose to retreat to minimize losses and just play for time while the bulk of the 8th Army, well, maybe not even the bulk, but just a good chunk of the 8th Army tries to mop these guys up or eliminates them quickly. and then shifts gears over to here. I probably want to put some kind of markers on where where we determine like the demoralization things that really matter for how close they get to Königsberg, but I just don't have all my extra game gear to be able to do that clearly, so that'll be a challenge. Okay, here we are at the start of turn 2. I made a huge mistake. So I started turn 1 and then 2, and I forgot about the mobilization rules. So there are mobilization rules that are effectively just certain units cannot activate to move or attack until they've been mobilized. And the schedule is a very short schedule, but it just means that in these very early phases, only certain units can move and attack. So on turn 1, effectively, which is August turn 3, that terminology is a little weird, all the 8-5 German infantry can move and attack. So you can see some movement here to fan out, ready to try to envelop some advancing Russians. And all of the 2-6 cav for the Germans, of which there's like 1 unit, I believe. So not a whole lot of movement possible. So you just see sort of a rough screen in front of the advancing Russian First Army, because on that very first turn, all the infantry units under the control of the First Army HQ, but not the HQ itself, can activate, and so they start moving, and they are advancing towards the Königsberg and the hexes that are closest to it. So you see that movement there, though the cavalry are currently fanning out, kind of screening so that these guys can advance without too much worry of something coming into the backfield. Unfortunately, it does mean that the German 1-4s, 5-5s, 2-4s over here couldn't move or activate, which kind of slows down their ability to do cool stuff, unfortunately. It also means that the Russian Second Army, which is down here, can't activate to move either. I guess activate's not the right word. The cavalry can actually do something. So the cavalry can, but the infantry cannot down here. So these guys are stuck where they're at. But you do see I'm trying to use the cavalry to screen, because what we don't want to have happen is when the Russians do move, and maybe I need to be a little more careful with the screen. I don't know. It's tough. I don't want. Well, I'll just say it's tough, because the infantry are going to go where they're going to go. So like this big stack here will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 if there's no adjacents and they use column movement. So like this is kind of the death hex, so to speak. And so trying to think about like how do we avoid the Germans doing that to us in a way that really hurts us. So I've got to kind of deal with some of that. But these guys aren't going to go until this turn, the second turn. The rest of the German 5-5 units and the 8th Army HQ can actually move. So the German 8th Army HQ can't move. But then the Russians are going to start, and then on turn 5, August turn 5, which is really turn 3 of the scenario, that's when everything else can move and attack without restriction. So this is all about positioning, like how do we lay the trap effectively for the Russians such that they're gonna steamroll ahead, and we're gonna have come around them basically and disrupt them as much as possible, potentially destroy the Second Army to some degree, or at least that's the idea. And in the meantime, these guys, ideally up in the north, are trading space for time, utilizing terrain, retreating where possible, so that they can hold, or at least delay the First Army, and then the Germans would use their rail movement to kind of come up and around, maybe through here or something, to try and take out the First Army. So that's kind of the thinking here. And at best, again, down here in the south, like the Russians can try to screen with cavalry and hope for the best, but the Germans are going to go again next, and these guys are probably going to head east. These guys are going to continue to come down, maybe even try to attack and hurt these cavalry and force them to retreat, and let these Russians advance into a corridor of murder. Basically, is what's going to potentially happen. It's going to be really rough. I don't think there's any way to avoid this if you're playing with the optional rule, but you're basically, by playing with the optional rule, you're leaning into the sort of bad moves of history that just were unavoidable for the actors in their historical positions. So otherwise, it maybe would be very hard for the Germans to win the scenario. With this, I would say it gives Germany the opportunity to get the win, and we'll see what happens. So going to hit turn 2, and we'll show the aftermath of that. I did, and just keep in mind, I am using the column movement where I can. So, some units are moving greater than 4 or 5 movement points, so long as they don't get adjacent to an enemy and expect to attack or anything like that. Okay, here we are at the start of the third turn of the scenario, which would be August turn 5. This is at the end of this turn, we determine several things related to the German reinforcement penalties. You can see, the Russians are advancing, kind of in a bad spot, and we'll see this come to a head. Or the Russians are moving into a bad spot as the Germans are kind of positioned to potentially just knock that stack out pretty severely. Elsewhere in the north, the Russian army is advancing. They forced the German cavalry to retreat. Well, they had to have a combat because Russian cavalry was involved, and so the German cavalry couldn't retreat before combat. In the combat itself, we opted to take a retreat option, so we didn't triple our defense, we doubled it. We did inflict a step loss. One of the attacking Russian cavalry had to take that step, or that strength point loss, so one of the Russian cavalry is now off map. The German cavalry took a step and flipped onto its backside and retreated. So right now the Russians are really focusing on kind of getting through this area here so that they can come at Königsberg above the river line, because these 285s are in a pretty strong position behind the river. The other problem for those units beyond this river up here is that their supply tracing to the HQ for the 8th Army is extended, which means if not for the fact that cavalry are supplied all the time, that's going to cause this line of defenders to be much weaker, so we're going to have to pull these guys back, basically, for both better supply tracing and other stuff. Basically, if you're beyond 4 movement points on the attack from your HQ, you suffer penalties equal to the distance, and then if you are counterattacking and it's greater than 8 movement points, that's when you start subtracting from your strength. So definitely need to watch the supply lines here for basically everything, even around here as we get going, because these guys are going to be even weaker if they can't trace supply to the HQ. They can't be thrown supplies, maybe a way to look at this if you're OCS minded. So supply is definitely a factor here in terms of like the positioning of the units, how our units are going to be set up, where can they go, what can they do. These Russian cavalry are thinking about ways to try to like slip past these infantry and cut off some supply tracing. So definitely some options that are still open for the Russians, but the hurt is about to come in on these Russian units here. That's going to allow for a flipping of the script, so to speak. And then the question will be, do the Germans kind of, move back up north and stop that? Do they try to take out these, well, I guess those are probably unassailable fortresses. So I think the Germans are going to aim to kind of knock these guys out if they can, and then move forward. And technically this guy now might be surrounded, and I'm going to have to take a look at that. If that was possible for him to be surrounded, then I would probably opt to have not moved him there and would need to correct that, but just some stuff there. So this next turn is going to be important, a lot more combats than just sort of the cavalry skirmish overrun that we've seen, and we'll go from there. Okay, here we are after the end of August turn 5, where this is kind of a major shift in the game. So the rest of the 6 turns of the scenario are all kind of predicated on how the first 2 turns go, because now we'll have rail movement and various things. To show the aftermath of what has gone on, I guess the steamroller rules, at least the way that I played them, and I think I played them correctly, but they're kind of the play dumb rules. The Russians had to keep moving forward, which allowed the Germans to encircle the Russians, and then in a surrounded attack where the Russians were defending at a weaker strength level, and they were forced to retreat on the German attack roll, which meant they only had. So the way it ended up working is if your units are out of supply, they can always basically be involved in combat with half strength. The Germans did enough damage in terms of strength points on their roll that it forced a surrounded stack to retreat, so they only got double their strength. And they didn't do enough damage to really clear any hexes, and so the retreat basically couldn't be completed, because when you're surrounded and need to retreat from a Zoc to a Zoc, you're eliminated instead. And that functionally eliminated, like, well, I'm trying to look what it was again, like 27 strength points of Germans off the map, just lickety split like that, which also provided a huge amount of demoralization points to the Russians. So what is left of the Second Army is a couple of these divisions with some cavalry, a couple divisions up here, and a brigade here, which on their own now, without those other 27 some points of strength, these guys can't really expect to do a whole lot of damage, and really the Germans just need to look at performing some level of mop up. Now, these units are no longer the infantry, which were the only units constrained, are no longer constrained and can choose to move and attack as they will. But at this point, as the Germans start looking at this next turn, they have some options. They can either try to push the advantage and do their very level best to kind of shut down the rest of the Second Army. Their HQs retreated back. I've had them retreat back to the unassailable fortresses because I don't want to lose the HQ. But at this point, these units are almost just holding a line and trying to be a distraction to the biggest contingent of the German 8th Army, so they can't head north. But I think just on the odds and on the numbers that we have, I think the Germans can certainly look to, kind of fight back, penetrate some lines, destroy something, maybe even just clear this cavalry and then be in a position to kind of knock everything else out. So that's kind of the potential that we're looking at here. So the Second Army is essentially destroyed. There are remnants that at best they can prove a distraction, and that may be their best bet. In the north, the Russians continue to push, and they're starting to push into the Germans. However, there have been a number of die rolls that basically, actually, I should point out, all the die rolls down here really went to the Germans. Like this big attack here, the Germans rolled a natural 6, and the Russians rolled a 1. Up here, while not as quite as a significant of a difference, the Russians have failed to cross this river line here. They're trying to push through here because that's really their best angle of attack in terms of terrain, but it's taken time to kind of push their way through there. But now that we have the ability to move and operate as we want to, we can shift a greater amount of our strength up here to try to force the issue. Now, in terms of reinforcements, the Russians are going to get a fair number over the course of these turns. So while we maybe have attrited some of our Russian forces away, there's still plenty to use to try to pressure the Germans, and the Germans really don't get much. The one significant thing that also occurred at the end of turn 5, we determined the German reinforcements. So the way that we calculate this is depending on how many units are close to Königsberg by movement points, those points are tallied to determine how many German reinforcements come from the West Front. There's a really handy dandy picture on Board Game Geek in the file section that allow you to kind of look at, like, this hex is this many movement points away, so you can make that easy calculation by just looking at that picture. And I calculated that the Russians had 31 points. I used that marker there just as a placeholder counter, which meant that uh, 285 units, but one at half strength, are going to come in as extra reinforcements, as well as this cavalry division, which means that the moralization points of the Germans actually goes up by 7 from where it was. So now the demoralization points of the Germans are up to 15. That's generally so far only coming from combat losses and then the German reinforcement penalty that we just calculated. The Russians are now at 61. So you see their DM markers flipped over to the plus 50. They're they're basically that, like, all of that is functionally coming from the disaster of the Second Army, plus a couple of several step losses here and there with the rest of these forces. So there's a certain element of suffering that's going on for these guys that is just going to continue to get higher potentially as we go. If we were trying to adjudicate victory right this second, it would be something like a German substantial victory. The majority of the demoralization points that could arrive for the Germans are going to be if the Russians get into different cities or towns, and if we see the elimination of certain units by the Russians. They've got a pretty big deficit to make up. So it's going to be really hard to tell, like, where can they make progress. Will it do anything for us? The other important thing I guess I should point out is that the Germans can get a bunch more demoralization points by having units near Königsberg, by the Russians having units near Königsberg, but I don't know that it's enough to make up for the fact that the Second Army just got thrashed unbelievably bad. So one of those weird things, like, does these optional rules just guarantee a German victory? Maybe. And if you play without them, does that guarantee a Russian victory? I don't know, maybe. It's kind of hard for me to tell, being pretty new to the system. So anyway, I'll get started here with the next turn, August turn 6. Rail movement is available for the Germans, which could help them shift theaters a little bit, or shift positions with some of these units at the very least. I may want to simply reposition the HQ so that these guys are all in kind of better supply tracing, because these guys up here have a lot of problems with that. Anyway, I'll play it. We'll keep seeing what happens. All right, here we are at the beginning of the first September turn. So there's really 4 turns left in the whole scenario. The Germans have managed to push pretty deeply into Russia, though they're getting kind of to the edge of their supply line, which kind of it causes some logistical challenges for the Germans, because they need to keep the HQ around here to try to help these guys, or else we're going to start counting units at half strength. But they've kind of been on a roll, just kind of pushing down. These guys are trying to get back because they're useless on their own. Now they're a little bit closer to being in trace. There will continue to be Russian reinforcements coming through here through the next several turns. It's just that now the Russians are so beat up that the Second Army has plenty of supply, but not enough units to actually make a difference against these strong Germans. So a lot of these other German units are going to be trying to drift northward to slow down the Russians. But it kind of feels like, down here, it's a victory for the Germans, keeping them down and out. And they actually did succeed in having another smaller stack of Russian units as part of the Second Army surrounded and destroyed. So there have been some pretty heavy hits to the Russian demoralization points just for that alone. It just happens to be we still got a lot of German strength points down here that are going to stop being super valuable. Really need to think about shifting them north. In the north, the Germans are pressured heavily. The only thing I would have to note on some of this is that The Russians have used a lot of supply, and if I counted right, and I'm reasonably sure that I have, the Russian First Army is actually down to 19 supply points, which um, I'm trying to think like all the different attacks that they've done. I guess I have been using up that much supply. Um, Means that depending on some very big battles, we could be sapping a lot of our supply away. So you figure you spend a supply point for every 4 attacking infantry strength. Well, if you launch a big attack, that's 16. We'll say it's strong for this game, maybe 16 combat strength. Well, that's 4 supply points. So we have, maybe if we're lucky, we'd be able to do that 4 times plus a smaller attack. Is that going to get us anywhere closer to Königsberg itself? Will we be in a good position for demoralization points? I don't think it's going to make that much difference, to be honest. So we'll see where we get at as we play through the September turns. Given that the demoralization points that the Germans would receive for the Russians being closer to Königsberg, or at least nearby, they're certainly going to get that. And even if we said, okay, they're going to get that all 4 turns of September, that would be a total of 8 demoralization points. Well, if we did 8 demoralization points from where the Germans are at now, that brings them to 30, 33, I guess, which is still substantially less than what is now the oh my gosh, 87 that we're up to now, demoralization points for the Russians. So it continues to look like a triumph of a victory despite all the pressure here. There's almost no pressure at all down here, and we've just completely eliminated Russian armies, like caused many divisions to surrender. And we can start to filter units north where the Second Army is just going to run out of gas, run out of shells effectively, to keep pushing, which, I know the Russians did have artillery shell and ammunition issues at some point in the early phases of the war. I might not have the timeline all right there, but it's going to start looking like a German victory because we played those optional rules. But I'll play through these next few turns and we'll see if that's really what ends up happening. Okay, I played through 2 turns, September turn 1 and September turn 2. And this is kind of where we're ending up. We've got some German units here that are really just holding a line. They're doing so at half strength, but really the Germans aren't in any real major danger of losing a bunch of units or things going catastrophically wrong anytime soon. Many of these units would be defending at half strength because the HQ has moved further north to provide better supply tracing for these other German units on the defensive. The Russians have certainly tried to fight their way through here, and they've gained some ground, but it's not going to make any big difference in terms of demoralization points at this point. And almost anywhere that the Russians are going to push, they're going to be at a pretty significant disadvantage in terms of the combat power of the Germans on defense. So at this point, with the Second Army largely destroyed, with plenty of reinforcements, but now the fighting being firmly performed in Russia, or what is would be functionally Poland, instead of Germany. The Russian attempt on Königsberg from that angle has failed. In the north, while the Russians have pushed in, anything they do at this point will likely cause them to lose more strength than the Germans, or at least even if it were completely even, that doesn't really get the Russians anywhere that they want to be. Their dwindling supply being what it is, while the 10th Army HQ came on, and I did rail it over this direction, and it's trying to move over. There's really, at best, 15 supply points over here, and maybe that would supply enough attacks to try to chip away at the Germans, but we're not going to get much better in terms of the attrition. That's going to change the difference in where the demoralization points are at. So because of that, I think I'm going to call it. I don't know that there's any point in trying to play through the last 2 turns, because all I see really happening is the Russians maybe trying to have something happen, but ultimately, even with die rolls being a factor, I don't think it's going to make up the deficit of demoralization points to make a big difference here. The Russians have failed to get into Königsberg. Technically, by the special rules of the scenario, they couldn't get in there if they wanted to. There's no other towns that are really under major threat by the of the Russians at this point. So there's really not very many places for the Russians to get more demoralization points on the Germans. So I think we're going to call this a German victory, and I should be able to just call it here. If we look at it just right now, assuming the Russians maintain their position in the north, the German demoralization points would reach 39 without any other combats. If you figure there would be maybe some last ditch efforts and we could attrit the Germans down, maybe at most we'd be getting close to 45, maybe something like that. Where at this point the Russians are at 97, which, assuming they try to make any more attacks, for Germany there's going to be 4 from holding positions in Germany. That will get them 2 per turn on the last 2 turns. And then we figure there's attrition. For the Russians, they will at least get some more attrition, you would think, because the Germans are probably going to defend at triple strength every time they can. And that's going to get them at least over 100 demoralization points. So we're just at the point where the Russians there's almost no way to avoid it. The difference is just so huge that almost every situation that I can think of, the way this would pan out, would be a German decisive victory with Russia suffering 50 points or more demoralization points than Germany suffers. So either that, or maybe the Russians can squeak it out to a German substantial victory. Either way, I think it's a German victory. Now, a couple of things, just as we are contemplating the turns here, there's only so many turns, right? And which makes this a good introductory game, right? So you're really talking 9 turns total. For much of it, no rail cap. The Germans really don't get much in the way of reinforcements, and what ones they do come with a demoralization point penalty. So I think it really comes down to whether or not you're using those optional rules. So you're using both the steamroller, meaning the Russians are going to charge ahead into the fray, maybe for the worse, while simultaneously using the demoralization points for German reinforcements coming in. Now, if you weren't playing with those, interestingly enough, at least the way that I'm seeing it, the Russians would have free reign over all their units from the get-go, while the Germans would really not get any reinforcements at all, other than the small handful they get as part of the natural reinforcement schedule. They're not going to get the special reinforcements from the west, or whatever that comes in. You could pick one or the other to play with, I guess, which maybe you get the German reinforcements. If you were to just play with that, I wonder if that would be enough to shift the difference such that it would be a more even game. Because I think if you're not playing with any of the optional rules, it just feels like it's super likely that the Russians are going to win, just on sheer numbers, and the fact that you don't have to play as foolish as the Russians maybe did during the Battle of Tannenberg. So I mean, they were locked in the gears of history. The optional rules put that in place. So maybe you could try to figure out some way to not get totally owned as the Russians playing with the optional rules. But it definitely feels like, who's going to win is going to depend entirely on whether or not you play with those rules, which kind of makes it like so one-sided depending on those factors that maybe as a standalone game, I'm not sure how I feel about this particular scenario. Now, that's a different opinion from just the way that the game system works, but it's a commentary on just the scenario design. If you don't play with the historical constraints, the Germans are likely to lose. If you do play with the historical constraints, the Germans are very likely to win. Make peace with that how you will. I have not read enough after action reports to know for sure what the variance is on that. but that's kind of my takeaway, just kind of looking at it. Now, this is meant to be an introductory game, meaning, okay, if the end results are not incredibly widespread, maybe that's okay, because really this game is just meant to teach you the basics of how to play the Der Weltkrieg series, and I think this does do a pretty good job of that. I've certainly had a good time kind of learning the ins and outs of the rules, and when does it make sense to try to attack, when does it make sense to maybe hold back, when does it make sense to do the retreat as opposed to standing and fighting. And generally, I like the system, and I do like the way the hexes are set up. I found that way of moving and just considering terrain is very nice. It is not confusing at all, because functionally you're just looking at what the hex sides are, really. And so it is just a very clever little system, and I like that. The supply point system is pretty basic. It's certainly easier than OCS in many regards. Not that OCS is that complicated, but it is pretty straightforward in order to understand your relationship between the supply points that you get, and you only get a certain amount in this scenario, but they can be used to power up your, have your units be able to fight, period. You always have the option to not use supply or be kind of too far away from your HQ to get supply and fight at half strength. So there's always, like, you can always do something, even if it's not very good, but that where your HQ is really determines things. So the Germans having to swap between, where's the HQ leaning? Is it running up here and letting them do some stuff and fight better? Are they moving back down here to let them fight and do stuff better? I'd move this guy north just to make sure that on the counterattacks, these guys were attacking at a better strength value than if they were too far away and were too weak. That was sort of the critical thing of where that HQ was. So I think in terms of learning the rules and just having a scenario to play around with to understand how things work, with a lot of different varied terrain, whether we're talking about rivers or the woods or broken terrain, all of that was pretty useful, and was a good run through. So as an introductory game, I think this Tannenberg folio package does work. It does teach you how to play the basics of the game and how things generally work. What it is not, maybe, and ultimately, maybe this requires some additional feedback from other folks. I don't think that, I do not know that it's a very competitive game, if only because of the way the optional rules swing things. So if you've played this specific package, that's separate, I mean, it's technically included in the East Front packaged game of Der Weltkrieg, but if you've played this before, and maybe I've made a bad assessment here around those optional rules, let me know in the comment section down below. I'm interested to hear what folks think about that. I don't think it's a bad scenario necessarily. Again, for training purposes, it's good for that. But I do wonder, if you're really looking for a good competitive scenario, does this make sense? Let me know what you think. This isn't necessarily a review video, it's just a playthrough, and it's been interesting for me, at least, trying to walk through and see how things operate, and for that I'm very thankful. So I think that'll do it for this one, guys. Gaming on the go. Again, by the time you see this video, I'll be safe and sound at home, and able to do more stuff in the very near future. But a nice change of pace here while on the road for work. So thanks for watching, folks. We'll see you in the next video whenever I get to do that. Take care. Keep on gaming.